1. Hi, everyone. My name is Jack Eggeman.
I'm Krystal Brown.
I'm Kristy Kocot.
I'm Vanessa, Rivera.
And I'm George Little.
And today we're going to be presenting on Chapter 11, Cultural Rhetorical Studies and Rhetorical Theory by Timothy Borchers and Heather Hundley. To start off our presentation, we are going to introduce our thesis in order to provide you with a broad understanding of what we're going to be discussing throughout this presentation. We will then move into a discussion regarding the key terms, summary, main arguments, main connections, and scholarly source used within this presentation. The thesis of this chapter is, although there are key elements and differences among the studies of rhetoric and culture, these areas of focus are closely related, and the study of rhetoric benefits from the understanding of cultural studies. The work of cultural studies can be used to inform rhetorical analyses, and writers and rhetoricians can employ both a cultural and rhetorical study in order to effectively make judgments about a text.
Throughout this chapter, we've come across many key terms that enhance our understanding of cultural rhetoric study, with the first term being representation. Representation is the meaning for a symbol as created through interaction. It reviews that meaning is dependent on how something such as a person, an idea, or an object is represented. It helps the idea that we might have a different meaning. It helps explain the idea that we might have a different meaning for the same thing because of different perspectives that we have on the issue. Next is articulation, which is a type of representation. Articulation is defined as the joining of two ideas that do not necessarily have any type of natural connection. The relationship between religion and politics can be used to help understand this term. According to the founding fathers, church and state should be separated. Despite this, religion has been articulated with politics over the years and plays a pretty big role with our political structure. This idea of articulation is important to keep in mind because once ideas have been articulated, it is very hard to separate them from one another in one's mind. Following articulation is cultural studies. Cultural studies is a discipline that is concerned with the production, circulation, and reception of a meaning in industrialized societies. This is an important study as it closely relates to our study of rhetoric and can even aid in our work in rhetoric studies. Next is interpretive communities, which are defined as audience who decode a text in a similar manner. The idea that people can interpret text differently is largely expressed within this culture, but this key term functions to show that some groups may interpret ideas the same way. When they do, they can be referred to as interpretive communities. Following interpretive communities is signification. This term is defined as the study of the process of meaning. Signification is important as it helps to strengthen the understanding that meaning is not something that is fixed. This term relates directly to the next term, signifying practices, which are defined as the ways that symbols attain meaning. Through this chapter, we are introduced to the many ways symbols can gain their meaning. One of these ways is that our position in relation to the image determines what that image means to us. What also plays a role in how we view symbols' meanings is the way we identify with the image or symbol. Overall, we give certain things meanings based on our particular cultural context. Lastly, subject positions is a key term that is defined as one way of reading a text from a particular perspective. In other words, Borchers and Hundley states that a text positions its readers to look at it in a particular way. The three different subject positions that one can take while interpreting a text include dominant or preferred, negotiated, and oppositional. Dominant or preferred subject positions are defined as a reading of the text that accepts the most obvious interpretation. It espouses the dominant ideology. Negotiated subject positions are defined as the reading of the text where audiences understand the dominant ideology but adapt it to fit their own experiences. Oppositional subject positions are defined as a reading that opposes the dominant ideological message presented in the text.
Sorry about that. Now we have discussed the main key terms included throughout Chapter 11. Let's examine how these terms relate to the greater summary of the chapter's main points. The chapter centers around rhetorical theory and its coordination to cultural studies. Culture in this case refers to the complete way of life for groups of people. The differences between cultural theory and cultural studies is also discussed. Culture studies scholars focus on political economy, content, and audiences, while critical theorists may more so emphasize the cultural product, modes of production, and the audience effect. The text further dives into the concept of culture as representation, or the process of how we learn to organize these ideas, people, or objects. Representation is telling in the analysis of class, ethnicity, and gender. We assign meaning to groups and cultures based on representation. The particular context of a text or form of media, or even what is not included within that specific medium, can be telling of representation and culture. Meaning as seen as contested in culture, signifying that meaning cannot be fixed or set completely. The chapter utilizes examples of media, such as the television shows Fixer Upper and Fresh Off the Boat. The show's references exemplify the manner in which how certain groups or messages are portrayed and how they influence the context of cultural studies. In the case of the show Fixer Upper, the author expresses how the program curated a brand image for itself, which projected ideological messages onto its audience. On the other hand, the television program Fresh Off the Boat was referenced for its position as the only sitcom portrayal of an Asian family. The observation of these shows helps us understand how ethnicity, class, gender, and even ideologies can relate to what is known as culture studies. Overall, this chapter functions to reveal how a combined approach of culture and rhetoric studies can make for an effective analysis of a text or a certain medium.
Now that you have an understanding of what this chapter entails, we are going to move into the chapter's arguments. Although there are many arguments made throughout this chapter, we have chosen 3 significant arguments and ideas to focus on throughout this presentation of chapter 11. The first of these arguments is that cultural studies scholars expand on the focuses of critical theorists by examining representation and signification, and it is through these focuses that these scholars reveal how meaning arises and identity forms. So basically, the critical theorists have some focuses within their study, which include things like modes of production, the cultural product, and its effects on an audience. What cultural studies scholars decided to do was expand on these same areas by looking deeply into context, which includes the ideas of representation and signification. Stuart Hall, a very influential cultural theorist, believed these 2 ideas were thought of as central to how we, members of society, create meaning. He believed that meaning can always be contested, as meaning depends on how individuals, objects, or ideas are represented. In other words, different meanings can arise depending on the representation of an object, idea, or person. Going even further, Hall suggested that meaning doesn't even exist until the idea has been represented. To explain this, Borchers and Henley provide us with an example of Jessica Lynch, who became a symbol for American courage and bravery after being captured in the Iraq War and rescued by American troops. Before this representation, Lynch was just an ordinary American. Her representation of a symbol of courage and bravery was non-existent before the event itself. Following representation is signification, which further reveals how meaning and identity arise. Through signification, we learn that absence deepens and expands the meaning we create for something. For example, if we see a family image of a mother and her daughter, we might recognize that there is no father in the picture. By seeing the absence of the father, we create the meaning that the mother is a single parent. Another factor of the process of signification includes the idea that we project ourselves into an image in order to create meaning. Basically, our position in relation to the image determines the meaning we give to it. Ultimately, representation and signification show how we create meaning, yet they are also expanded to identity, as our feelings of who we become are influenced by how we identify with certain things, like images and symbols within our culture. The next argument we focused on is that cultural studies scholars believe that audiences are active participants in the interpretation of a message, and therefore different meanings can be drawn from the same text due to one's cultural context and past life experiences. They argue that the audience is not controlled by text, but rather the audience makes their own meaning and interpretation of the text. As active audience members, the receiver can decode messages in a number of ways, regardless of the way the sender has encoded the message. This active position in the decoding of a message is due to the different cultures and backgrounds the audience members have. Members of an audience will each respond to text differently based on their position and identity in their cultural context. This allows for multiple meanings to be made out of the same idea, text, or object. We can go back to the same example of Jessica Lynch used in the previous argument. I mentioned that individuals viewed her as a symbol of courage and bravery. While this was true for some, there were also people who saw Lynch as a symbol of what was wrong with the Bush administration's rationale during this time. This reveals that each individual interpreted the meaning of Lynch differently depending on their cultural feelings towards the war. The last argument of focus includes that employing a critical methodology that uses a combined approach of the studies of rhetoric and culture may result in a more accurate and effective analysis. These studies have differences, yet when used together, one can better understand the true contextual meaning of a text. The studies of rhetoric and the studies of culture have specific focuses. Some of these differences include the fact that rhetorical studies focus on text, it takes a neutral position towards an artifact, and it focuses on legitimate social institutions. As for cultural studies, this study takes a focus on context, has a political position towards the issue at hand, and emphasizes alternative institutions that resist establishment. Despite these differences, these areas of study merge and overlap in many ways, and rhetoric's relationship to cultural studies is difficult to ignore. The argument being made here is that when these factors are combined and looked at as a whole, a very detailed, impactful analysis can be conducted. To support this, Borchers and Henley provide readers with a case study of two individuals, Blair and Michelle, who examined the astronauts' memorial at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center in Florida. When taking a rhetorical perspective by just focusing on the memorial itself, the individuals concluded that the memorial was impactful and appropriate to the situation. They believed it to be interesting and rich for its viewers. Just when they thought of the memorial as a success, they noticed that the audience of the memorial did not have reactions that aligned with their analysis. They didn't seem to recognize the significance of the memorial and carried on with their conversations after looking at it for just a brief moment. Along with this, the two individuals conducting the study recognized that each individual in the audience wore Disney attire. By taking a cultural perspective and analyzing the context in which the individuals were viewing the memorial, Blair and Michelle realized that the viewers saw the memorial as just another theme park attraction, as they most likely were stopping at the Space Center on their way to or from Disney World. By taking a combined approach, Blair and Michelle acknowledged that although the memorial is appropriate and meaningful, it fails to be effective to the crowd that typically comes in and out of the Space Center. They concluded that analyzing texts with only a rhetorical perspective is not wrong, but it is just one way to analyze something. By combining different approaches, a more full and accurate conclusion can be drawn.
Overall, the ideas expressed throughout this chapter can be applied to each of our lives, as individuals can't help but be influenced by various messages and dominant ideologies that permeate the media. Through this chapter, we learn to be more active audience members by rhetorically and culturally examining TV shows, advertisements, music, texts, and other forms of communication we come across throughout our lives. Examining forms of media in a less passive way will allow us to no longer be subject to dominant ideologies that pervade our society. Also, employing cultural studies also allows us to learn more about our own selves, as the meanings we draw from the text are related to the social structures and history of our own cultures and backgrounds. In conclusion, applying these components of cultural studies along with components of critical theory allows writers and rhetoricians to have more control over navigation of their everyday lives. As for a connection to this course, Chapter 11 enables writers and rhetoricians to understand the ideas that a message's meaning is strongly dependent upon cultural factors. Recognizing that meaning is produced from within one's cultural context is important, as this allows writers and rhetoricians to understand why someone might not interpret a message the same way as they did. We can learn to more effectively communicate to certain groups of people by acknowledging that an individual may interpret a message differently due to their cultural context. Furthermore, There are also certain aspects of this chapter that closely relate to the content that we have studied throughout this course. For instance, in chapter 5, we studied personalization and conversational tones and learned that these techniques can be used to further persuade audiences. In chapter 11, we learned how to commercially in various media sources, In chapter 11, we learn how commercials and various media sources attempt to use their persuasive strategies in order to encourage their audience to believe the ideologies it portrays. By being aware of these techniques, we are able to combat their influence on us. Another key term we focused on in chapter 5 was symbolic signs. From this, we learned that culture assigns meaning to certain symbols. This idea is elaborated on in chapter 11 as we learn exactly why one culture may have a different meaning than another culture from the same sign. In addition to chapter 5, chapter 6 also closely relates to the course's content of chapter 11. In chapter 6, we are first introduced to the idea that context controls how we are ascribed meaning to symbols. We learned that from Ogden and Richard's believed context was one of the main reasons individuals interpreted things differently from one another. In chapter 11, Rocher and Hundley continue the discussion of this idea and examine how one's cultural assumptions determine how they interpret or make meaning out of objects, ideas, or individuals. Along with connecting to the content of this class itself, this chapter also reveals some direct links to SMAD courses. Some SMAD courses teaches the idea that media skews our thoughts on certain stories, people, or groups of people, resulting in stereotypes and false beliefs. In my SMAD 150 course, we learned that there are new perpetuates. We learned that their new perpetuates the idea that violence and crime has significantly risen over the years. What is interesting is that the level of violence and crime have actually decreased over the years. Yet individuals are still persuaded to act on the same false ideas that they are exposed to on the media. Through chapter 11, we were provided with many to combat the influence of the ideologies being portrayed by the media. Brochures and Hundley express how we can function as active audiences who take a negotiated and oppositional subject position to the various ideas we are presented with. A negotiated subject position is where the audience doesn't accept the ideology the text is trying to portray, but doesn't reject it either. They decode it in a way that suits their interests. An oppositional subject position is one who resists the text's ideological message. When watching the news, we can learn to not just passively participate, but rather think about what is true or what is false. Think of how we identify with what is being portrayed, and also think about the motives behind what is being presented in the news.
So, in order to further enhance our understanding of the ideas presented in the chapter, we used a scholarly source from the journal Current Perspectives in Social Theory, and the article is called Epistemology, Culture and Rhetoric, Some Social Implications of Human Cognition. And in the article, the authors Burns and Lemoine outline how cognitive processes merge with social processes. They focus on how culture is created through the use of symbols in individual level. For example, in the reading, they say, we consider theoretical imperial work in cognitive psychology in the ways individuals process information in a social context, and then progress to more macro level cultural phenomena. Therefore, they claim that culture and social phenomena affect how people process information. Additionally, they explore how limits on information processing affects cultural hegemony. For example, in the reading, the authors claim that cultural similarities can be seen as similarities in ways of processing information. This means that people can only process so much information at a time, so they have to pick and choose what information they process using their cultural background. So one connection we found in our chapter, the authors discuss how audiences are active participants in the interpretation of a message, and therefore different meanings can be drawn from the same text due to one's cultural context and past life experiences. Similarly, the article by Burns and Lemoyne is focused on how someone's cultural background can affect how they perceive messages. They discuss how symbols and rhetoric on an individual level are affected by cultural and social contexts. Specifically, they say in the article that, quote, legitimacy of an argument is likely to be judged against the backdrop of semantic networks, but these networks arise in and are modified in a social context.
So we hope that you've learned about the connections between critical theory and cultural studies throughout this presentation. And we encourage you to analyze text not in just one way, but in many ways in order to strengthen your skills as a writer and a rhetorician. So we have also included a discussion prompt to help you think about the things that we have talked about today. And our discussion prompt is to think of a TV show that you have watched before. What type of subject position do you take while watching this show and why? We have also included our Works Cited page, and that is all for today. Thank you for watching.